So Hugh, thank you so much for joining me to chat about your brand new book, your memoir, Playing Under the Piano.
Gosh, it sounds really strange to hear it spoken aloud. You know, my memoir, my first book as well. So it's very exciting and trouser-wettingly exciting. Yes.
Hopefully none of that today. We'll see.
You haven't seen what I'm wearing. Luckily, the camera is stopping around here.
And so it charts kind of your life in terms of with your parents, but also your love of theatre and your kind of progress into acting. What was it that made you think, I want to be up on the stage, I want to be the one performing?
Well, I think there were a couple of factors, really. One is we had a really good dressing up box at home. My dad had done his national service in the Far East. My mum had been born in Egypt. So there were these exotic clothes in the dressing up box, partly dad's uniform or clothes they'd picked up in the Far East or mum from Egypt. And from my granny, old old frocks. So I got into cross-dressing from an early age. I love putting on frocks and just inventing characters, really. And my mates in my road only wanted to play football and play, German soldiers and British soldiers in the back garden. But I really wanted to put on plays. So I pretended to really be into football, so to get them on side, so to speak. And then I'd reel them in and get them to be in my little plays at home. So that was a factor that just I suppose trying to use my spare time or use my imagination in my spare time.
And teenage you got in your head that you really wanted to be Cassias in Julius Caesar. What was it about Cassias that caught your attention?
I don't know. I can't remember actually, but I do remember auditioning. I was so wet behind the ears. I just joined big school. And having, played decent parts, I suppose, at my junior school, suddenly I thought, oh, I'll be able to do that at the big school too. And I was quite a chunky lad. And, of course, Cassias has a lean and hungry look. So why, I remember this teacher asking me about it, saying, what have you been doing today? I said, I've just auditioned for Julius Caesar, sir. And he said, which part are you hoping for? Cassias, sir. And he sort of laughed. And I said, and there was this chunky boy whose voice hadn't broken, thinking he could play one of the leads in the school play.
Is it true that you still remember the lines?
For once upon a raw and gusty day, the troubled Tiber chafing with her shores, Caesar said to me, yes, I can remember quite a lot of it.
And you mentioned a minute ago about your passion for acting. Why do you think it matters so much that acting and the arts more broadly should be accessible to everyone?
The number of times I've been at an event, a public speaking event, in the audience, and seen someone who's got this wealth of information and wealth of talent, but is so bound up and tight about being in front of an audience and not being able to communicate it, not being able to look that audience in the eye, and their breathing goes and they get tighter and tighter, and of course that just ripples out across the audience and everyone's feeling really tense, and none of the information that this fantastic amount of knowledge that this person may have, or this great widget they want to share, they can't do it because they're so blocked off and self-conscious. Something as simple as doing a theatre game in a classroom environment eases people into being able to communicate and look at each other as you and I are now with confidence and express things to each other, express emotion, express information.
Talking of kind of the importance of the arts and the joy of it, your dad, he is a musician. He loved music, and through dementia, that was the thing that he held on to for quite a long time. So what did you see that he got from that?
It was really the last tangible thing that my dad had access to. As his journey went deeper into dementia, and luckily we were so blessed, my family, that his was a peaceful and benign form of the disease. Of course, Alzheimer's can be very, very cruel and can be violent, and personalities can change horribly. With my dad, fortunately, it didn't happen. He was still always a gentle, kind man. But the music was the thing that kept him in touch. And I'd go around to his apartment and, for a morning coffee, and sometimes I'd sit outside the room just so I could hear him play. Because when he was playing music, he was in touch with the world and not fading away.
And you found out something quite amazing about your mum that you didn't know for many years. You found out that she was part of MI6.
I know. It really, I mean, yeah, it does sound really cool.
It does sound so
It does
cool.
sound cool. But, I mean, it was not quite as glamorous as you might think. She wasn't, Rosa Klebb or indeed Moneypenny or anything like that. But often in the school holidays, I'd go with Dad, and we'd drop Mum off at this office block in Lambeth North, and then I'd go on with Dad on his rounds of the hospitals in central London, and it was just Mum's office. And then one day when I was years later, 20 years later, I opened the evening newspaper one day, and it said MI6 building to be sold, and I thought that's Mum's office. So I rang her up, and she was out in the garden, and Dad called her in, and she went, "Hello," and she always had this funny telephone voice, and I said, "Mum, were you in MI6?" And she said, "Oh." And I said, "My God, you were a spy." He went, "Well, no." And I said, "But you worked at Century House. That's MI6." And she said, "Well, yes, dear." And I said, "What did you do there?" "Oh, just a bit of filing." I said, "You never told me you worked for." "Oh, I wasn't allowed to. One doesn't talk about that sort of thing." And I mentioned this on the radio show Desert Island Discs, and a few days later, via Frank Gardner, the security correspondent at the BBC, I got a message saying, a gentleman from River House, MI6, would love to talk to you. Would you be open to it? And I thought, oh my God, am I going to be strapped to a chair and have my nuts used for baseball practice or something? And invited me to go in and have a chat over lunch to the gang, to the employees. And so I went to MI6, and a man my age, a bit younger than me, came up to me and said, "I work with your mum." And I said, "Oh," he said, I joined when I was 18, so I was very new, and she was in charge of our little bit of whatever section it was called. But the thing that really got to me, or touched me, was he said, we'd be sitting there in the office, doing the crossword, and suddenly we'd hear these footsteps. And we'd go, that's Pat, quick, everyone, quick. And he described the footsteps, and I suddenly remembered those footsteps because I'd heard her on, plenty of floors in the past, and the way that she walked. And suddenly it was this strange emotional connection through a sound. And I suddenly felt very close to this bloke because he knew my mum in a world that I never knew her in. And it led on to a couple of other stories, which I talk about in the book, about other people who I didn't realise that she worked with in a professional capacity. And I thought they were just I thought it was just Derek from the village, and so it was fascinating. It was really fascinating. But the way that this memory was connected, suddenly she came alive for me in a different way. Obviously, knowing this little bit more about her, but it was just the footsteps, the sound of the footsteps that he remembered, and I suddenly remembered them too.
I love that kind of legacy.
Yeah.
So there are two films film and a TV show and another two films that we can't not talk about. So Downton Abbey and Paddington. Let's start with Downton.
Yeah.
It's such a fan favourite. There's so much warmth around it and so much joy. It became like this massive hit in a time when period drama was maybe not kind of the flavour of the month. So why do you think that Downton was the thing that became the hit?
I think it had a lot to do with the feelings I felt when I read it, which was I wanted to know what happened next, and I quite liked spending time with these characters, and there were enough of them to be, to find your favourite, or you could ignore. And also the pace of the show was so fast that you could, latch onto a new character or a new story very quickly. But also, the production values were fantastic. I've worked on shows where, you're reading a letter and it's just got squiggle, or, a shopping list really. But, if Robert Crawley as Lord Grantham was reading a letter from, Mr. Johnson, the butcher, there's a letter from Mr. Johnson, the butcher, in beautiful period calligraphy describing the meat or whatever it might be, or it's a letter from Lady Rose abroad about her adventures in France, and it's there, it's real, it's been written, and the audience is never going to see that, but I am, and that meant so much to us as a team that everyone was really took great care in the detail, and albeit there was a sort of house rule that we wouldn't put our hands in our pockets. Now, whether that was just Alistair Bruce, who was our historical advisor. We called him the Oracle, and it was just a policy decision that the men wouldn't put their hands in their pockets, and we had to reshoot one scene because I'd forgotten that. And ultimately, I then had my trousers made in the second season without any pockets, so I couldn't do that again. But it was an escape. It was a place to escape to for many people.
Talking of going to, the next level lengths to do something, was that wall of water that hits you in Paddington real?
It was absolutely real. And it was quite funny. This is a mark of Paul King, the writer-director of Paddington, a mark of his determination and his genius, really. During the shoot of Paddington 2, every, once a week during lunch break, he'd go off to watch the rehearsal of the Wall of Water. And every time he'd come back and go, nope, it's not right, it's not right. Either it was, he said, I just don't believe it. When you open a door, you want to sort of believe that this water has built up behind the door with Paddington in the bath, and if someone can actually open a door like that and it would actually do that, you sort of believe it in the film because you've constructed the world appropriately. But each time he went to watch a rehearsal, either he'd open the door and the water would just go, or or it would spray out the sides, or it would anyway. It took weeks, if not months, and the effects team behind it, who built this what was a shipping container and cut a hole in it and worked out the water pressure and everything else. It took them ages, and finally we got there. But it was shunted down the schedule all the time because Paul was going, nope, it's not right yet. It's got to be absolutely right. Yes, it was a big wall of water.
How does it feel to get hit with a big wall of water?
I'm not going to give away technical secrets, but let's say there are other people in the world who look quite like me and are roughly my build, who sometimes, when I can't be asked to come out the trailer, help out a bit. But I'd like to point out that a lot of it was me.
Well, Hugh, this has been such a pleasure. The book is an absolute joy to read. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Holly.